24:14, a testimony to all peoples. Chapter 12, a church planting movement is a leadership movement, by Stan Parks. As we look around the world today, most dynamic church planting movements, CPMs, begin in areas with poverty, crisis, turmoil, persecution, and few Christians. In contrast, areas with peace, wealth, protection, and many Christians, churches are often weak and in decline. Why? Crisis forces us to look to God. A lack of resources usually forces us to rely on God's power rather than our programs. The presence of only a few Christians means that the church tradition is not powerful. This makes it more likely that the Bible will become the main source of strategy and principles. What can existing churches learn from these new movements of God? We can and should learn many lessons. One of the most important of them relate to leadership. In barren areas, we have to look for laborers in the harvest as new believers rise up to lead the way in reaching their own reached people groups. In many ways, a church planting movement is actually a movement of multiplying and developing church leaders. What makes the difference between merely planting churches and seeing sustained movements of churches? Usually leadership development. No matter how many churches are planted, unless the cultural insiders become leaders, the churches will remain foreign. They will either reproduce slowly or stop growing when the initial leaders reach their limit. Victor John is a leader of a massive CPM among the 100 million Bhojpuri speakers of northern India. Formerly known as the graveyard of modern missions, John points out that although the church has existed in India for almost 2,000 years, dating back to the Apostle Thomas, 91% of Indians still do not have access to the gospel. He believes this is mainly due to the lack of developing leaders. John states that beginning in the 4th century, the early Eastern Church imported leaders from the East and used Syriac language to worship, which limited those who could lead to only Syriac speakers. The Catholics in the 16th century lose the local language but never have thought of having local leaders. Beginning in the 18th century, Protestants appointed local leaders, but the training methods remained Western, and local leaders could not reproduce them. The replacement of indigenous leaders was done with a major conflict of interest. No natives, nationals, or local workers could ever be called leaders. This title was reserved for the whites only. These mission organizations focused on replacing of existing leadership and not movement growth. All too often, churches today, whether on the field or at home, we often focus on replacing existing leadership to keep the institution going, rather than focusing on midwifing God's birth of new disciples and churches. Despite overwhelming evidence that the new churches are far more effective in reaching lost people, many churches simply seek to grow larger instead of starting new churches. Seminaries continue this pattern by reinforcing a mindset of managing existing churches instead of putting equal or greater emphasis on training students to start new churches. We choose to invest the vast majority of our time and resources in our own comfort to the neglect of those headed for eternity in hell. Christians make 33% of the world's population, but receive 53% of the world's annual income and spend 98% of it on themselves. As we look at modern church planting movements, we can discern some clear principles for multiplying and developing leaders. Developing leaders starts with the beginning of the ministry. The patterns used in evangelism, discipleship, and forming churches are developing leaders. These patterns set the stage for ongoing leadership development. Vision, God-sized. CPM catalysts start with believing that an entire unreached people group, UPG, city, region, and nation can and will be reached. Instead of asking, "What can I do?" they ask, "What can we be done to see a movement started?" This keeps their focus and the focus of the new believers squarely on God. It forces them to rely on God to see the impossible happen. These initial outsiders play a crucial role in casting the vision to possible partners who will join in their harvest work. Any foreign outsiders must find a cultural near neighbor or insider believers who will rise up and lead the initial efforts to reach the group. As inside leaders emerge and multiply, they catch the same God-sized vision. Prayer, a foundation for fruit. John 14:13-14. One survey of effective church planters in a large church planting movement found them to be a very diverse group, but the one main thing they had in common, they all spent at least 2 hours a day in prayer and had special weekly and monthly times of prayer and fasting with their teams. These were not paid ministers. They had normal jobs, but they knew their fruit was tied to their prayer lives. This commitment to prayer by the planters gets passed on to new believers. Training. Everyone is trained. One woman at an Indian CPM leaders training said, "I don't know why they asked me to speak about church planting. I can't read and I can't write. All I can do is heal the sick and raise the dead and teach the Bible. I've only been able to plant about 100 churches. Don't we wish we were as lowly as she is?" In CPMs, everyone expects to be trained and to train others as soon as possible. In one country, when asked to train leaders, security concerns only allowed us to meet with 30 leaders, but each week this group trained another 150 people using the same biblical training materials. Teaching. Training manual is the Bible. One of the best ways to avoid unneeded burdens is to use the Bible as the training manual. CPM leaders develop other leaders by helping them depend on the Bible and the Holy Spirit rather than on themselves. When new believers ask questions, the church planter usually answers, "What does the Bible say?" Then they guide them to look at various scriptures, not just their favorite proof text. A foundational truth comes from John 6:45. In the NIV it says, "They will be taught of God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me." The church planter may occasionally exhort or give information, but his or her most common approach is to help new believers find answers themselves. Making disciples, forming churches, and developing leaders are all Bible-centered. This enables effective reproduction of disciples, churches, and leaders. Obedience. Obedience-based, not knowledge-based. John 14:15. The biblical training of CPMs is powerful because it does not focus on knowledge. Each person is expected to obey what he or she learns. Too many churches mainly focus on knowledge. Leaders are those who have the most knowledge, i.e., education. Success is gathering more members and teaching them more information. In CPMs, the focus is not how much you know, but how much you obey. As groups study the Bible, they ask, "How will we obey this?" The next time they meet, the answer is, "How did we obey?" Everyone is expected to obey, and leaders are identified as those who help others obey. Obeying God's commands in the Bible is the fastest path for disciples and leaders to become mature. Strategy. The gospel and Acts provides the main strategy and models. Not only does the Bible contain commands, it also contains pattern and models. In the 1990s, God led various people working among the unreached to focus on Luke 10 as a pattern for mission into new areas. Every church planting movement we know of uses variations of this pattern of laborers going out 2 by 2. They go seeking the person of peace who opens their homes and Ikios, or family, group. They stay with this family as they share the truth and power, and they seek to bring the whole Ikios to the commitment to Jesus. Since this is a natural group, not a group of strangers gathered together, Leadership is already present and just needs shaping instead of a wholesale transplant. This sounds obvious, but it is often overlooked. One example of this occurs in the discovery model of CPMs, where the interested Iolcos begins to study the Bible. A key series of questions is used to make disciples of those studying the story of God from creation to Christ. In some of these CPMs, the outsider will never ask the question. Instead, he or she will meet separately to coach an insider to ask the question. The answers come from the Bible, but the question asker learns to facilitate the process of learning and obeying. We see an example of this in T for T, training for trainers. Each new disciple learns to share what they learn by training others and thereby growing in ability to lead. The same principle applies to continuing to develop leaders. Believers have an opportunity to practice and train far more quickly than in most traditional church settings. Biblical leadership standards for Scripture. As leaders emerge and are appointed, biblical standards are used, such as the requirements for new church leaders in Titus 1:5-9, and for established church leaders in 1 Timothy 3:1-7. The believers discover and apply roles and responsibilities from a thorough study of leadership passages. As they do this, they find various character elements and skills needed at each stage of the maturing church. They also avoid foreign extra-biblical standards for requirements for church leaders. Unbiased focus on the fruitful. Matthew 13:1-18. Leaders are chosen not based on their potential, personality, or style, but on their fruitfulness. When anyone asks CPM trainers how we know who will be fruitful, when we first train people, we often laugh. We have no idea who will be fruitful. We train everyone, and the least likely often become the most fruitful, while the most likely often don't do anything. Leaders become leaders by reaching people who become their followers. As these leaders emerge, more time is given to those who are fruitful so they can produce more fruit. Special training weekends, weeks, annual training, conferences, intensives, training programs, often mobile, are some of the tools used to keep developing and equipping fruitful leaders. They in turn equip others. Shared multiple leaders. Acts 13:1. In most church planting movements, churches have multiple leaders to ensure more stability and to develop more leaders. This has the key advantage of allowing leaders to keep their existing jobs. This enables the movement to spread through ordinary believers and avoid crippling dependence on outside funds to pay leaders. Multiple leaders can better manage leadership tasks. They also have greater wisdom together and mutual support. Peer learning and support between multiple churches also play important roles in helping individual leaders and churches thrive. Churches focus on new churches. Appointing and developing leaders enables the planting of new churches on a regular basis, and this happens naturally. As a new church starts and is full of passion for their new Lord, they are asked to repeat the pattern that led to their salvation. So they begin to look for lost persons in their networks and repeat the same process of evangelism and discipleship that they just experienced and were trained to reproduce. In this process, they often realize that some of the leaders are gifted to focus inside the church, pastors, teachers, and etc., and some are gifted to focus outside, evangelists, prophets, apostles, etc. The inside leaders learn to lead the church, to be and do all that the church should be, both inside and out. The outside leaders model and equip the whole church to reach new people. Conclusion. What we can learn from God in these new movements. What can we learn from God in these new movements He has birthed? Are we willing to let go of cherished cultural denominational biases and use the Bible as our primary manual for birthing and developing leaders? If we follow biblical commands and patterns and avoid extra biblical requirements for leaders, we will see many more leaders emerge. We will see many, many more lost people reached. Are we willing to make this sacrifice for the sake of the lost and the glory of the Lord? The next section is called Throughout the Whole World, and it starts with Matthew 24:14, the editor's translation. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a witness to all peoples, and then the end will come.